Thank you all for being here tonight. It's such a delight to see your faces and to be all together in this room. Um, Please feel free, keep on coming in all the way up to the front if you'd like. There's plenty of seats up here and over on the right also. Um, I've already had a day that's involved a lot of different touch points with our community. And so I'm going to leave my script for a moment and just say that this is part of what I love so much about this community and the unique opportunity that I get to have in my lifetime of living here. Um, Loving, thoughtful, curious people taking advantage of opportunities to learn something more about an important issue that is impacting our community, that might be impacting people that you know personally, that might be impacting you personally. And that is a powerful, powerful thing. If we can hang on to that energy in all of the work that we have ahead, I'm humbled and I'm just so enthusiastic for what we will be able to accomplish. That off script part, first thing I'm supposed to tell you is that I'm Karin Knudsen, and it is my absolute pleasure to be here with you tonight, having helped to organize this event through my work with Better Housing Together, but also with so many of the other people who have been working on that effort and community led collaborative effort within our community for many years. So before I say anything more, I just want to take a moment to specifically thank Better Housing Together's board of directors, all of whom have been volunteering and working for years on this endeavor, to specifically also thank Lane County and Steve Adams and the partnership of his team, so much expertise at our county that they bring to this issue and work on every day. Betsy Schultz and our Eugene area realtors, Rebecca Lewis and Ben Clark, and the U of O School of Planning, Public Policy and Management, 3 p.m., as well as Brittany Quickwarner with the Eugene Chamber, and so many of the other incredible community partners who have decided, because they really care and think we can make a difference, to work on addressing our housing crisis in Eugene and in Lane County. Thank you all for all of your work. So I have had the good fortune to be working with Better Housing Together and that network of partners who decided that we wanted to work collaboratively to increase housing affordability, diversity, and supply in our community for about 8 years. And there are so many different ways that that group, through gatherings like this one and other community events, have helped us to extend and continuously reinvigorate the conversations that we're having about our housing crisis. Um, as you all well know, we have the dubious distinction of having one of the most challenging crises of housing and homelessness in the nation. And the profile of our housing crisis is unique to this community and is going to require us to be creative, innovative in specific ways that are tailored to this community. I am confident that we will rise to the occasion and that when we connect the dots um, and the insights that we can gather both from in our community and from thought leaders outside of our community, we can be successful. And our keynote speaker tonight, Greg Colburn, is one of those people, one of those thought leaders who just happens to be up the I-5 corridor in Seattle at the University of Washington, but whose work we have been using in our community to guide this conversation for a couple of years now. And Greg, I just also wanted to say to you that I'm sure one of the profound aspects of having written a book like the one that you've written with Clay is that there are communities all over this country that are able to better understand the type of problem that we have designed for ourselves to solve. And I don't just love the last line of your book because I'm an architect, but I think it's really, really important to remember that we are designing all of this every day. So Greg Colburn, our keynote for the 2024 Housing Summit, is an associate professor in the Renstead Department of Real Estate in the College of Built Environments at the University of Washington. And he is co-author of the book, Homelessness is a Housing Problem: How Structural Factors Explain U.S. Patterns. Greg serves as co-chair of the University of Washington's Homelessness Research Initiative and is a member of the National Alliance to End Homelessness Research Council. He holds a BA from Albion College, an MBA from Northwestern University, and an MSW and PhD from the University of Minnesota. You just don't see all of those together in one person very often. His work has been featured by The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Economist, Bloomberg, and National Public Radio, as well as many conversations within this very community over a number of years. So it's my delight to welcome Greg Colburn to the stage.
Podium's at an angle. I don't want to spill my water. Thank you, Karen, and congratulations on your election. You're going to serve this community well. I'm highly confident of that. I also want to thank the other sponsors and particularly colleagues here at the School of Planning, your planning policy and management. So it's great to be here. It's great to be at the University of Oregon. The Purple W is not passive aggressive, I assure you. Even though I'm from Minnesota, which is the epicenter of passive aggressive behavior, that was not intentional. And I didn't wear a purple tie. I thought that would be unnecessarily provocative. So I'm behaving myself. So I've given a lot of these talks around the country, and it's been interesting to get reactions from people. And so many of these happen in Uber or cab rides. And so last night I arrived at Eugene and got in a cab, and my best friend, we went to high school and college together, as an astronaut. And he has taken to telling people that he's an accountant when they ask him what he does, because everyone wants to talk about being an astronaut. And sometimes he's just like, I just don't want to talk about it. So last night I got in the car and he says, what are you here for? And I was like, well, should I say an audit? And I said, I'm giving a talk tomorrow. And he said, on what? I said, it's on homelessness. And then away we went. And it was interesting. And he was giving me statistics and telling me about what causes homelessness. And he concluded by saying, do you need a ride back to the airport? I said, well, I do on Friday. He said, I'd really appreciate the business so that I don't become one of your subjects. Right? So it's pretty powerful. And people are not agnostic on this topic. Right? Dealing with climate change is tough because a bunch of the people are like, I don't know what to do. Should I recycle? Right? There's just kind of this overwhelming nature of it. We don't have apathy in homelessness. People are angry about it. People are upset about it. They're passionate. And so I think we really need to harness that passion and move towards hopefully a good outcome here. So I'm, as Karen alluded to, have kind of a unique professional background. I was an investment banker and private equity investor for about 17 years and enjoyed that career. It was demanding. Went through the financial crisis, which was not a lot of fun, managing a massive portfolio, and was about to turn 40 in 2012 and had always had an interest in being a professor. So my wife and I were talking about this, and she's a very understanding person and finally agreed that we were going to pull the ripcord, and I did, and enrolled in a PhD program at the Humphrey School, the University of Minnesota, our policy school, and studied housing policy. So when people ask me, like, why do you study housing policy? Why did you pick that? Why did you go from this other career to this one? I say that there are two reasons. One is, and it kind of depends on my mood, which answer I give, but one is housing is fundamental. So I have colleagues at UW, and you have faculty here at University of Oregon focusing on all sorts of social outcomes that are really important. Education, healthcare, employment, all this stuff. But all of those outcomes that we care about are compromised if you don't have housing. If you want a kid to learn geometry, let's make sure that kid's housed, right? If you want an elder to be healthy, let's make sure that she's housed, right? So this is kind of a Maslow's argument here that we got to figure out this base level if we want these other things to happen. The other thing that motivates me is just a general frustration. I'm outraged that in the wealthiest country in the history of this planet, that we allow homelessness to persist at this level. This doesn't have to be. We can structure societies in a way that don't produce this outcome, and we just continue to allow it to persist, which is a source of frustration for many of us. So I moved to Seattle in 2017 when I was fortunate enough to get a job at the University of Washington, and I got invited to community conversations with probably a lot of people like in this room. And we were wringing our hands about homelessness in Seattle. Everyone agreed it was a problem. The Seattle Times wrote about it every single day. And the community generally was like, we're angry. We know we have a problem. It's getting worse, and we're spending all this money, and obviously we don't know what we're doing. As someone who thinks about public policy, that was a big concern for me, because once confidence in the public sector erodes, our ability to make a dent in this is compromised. And so my hope with this book was really to translate information that we've known in the academic literature for some time and translate that for a general audience. And so a lot of times faculty write books for other faculty. That wasn't the intent with this book. So as I wrote this, I actually had my parents in mind, who are college educated. They're not social scientists. And I wanted them to be able to engage with the book and understand it. And I figured if I could kind of hit that mark, then a lot of people could engage with the book in a productive way. And that's somewhat unusual. It's actually kind of a professional risk. And I talked to my dean about this and other faculty at UW and just said, hey, I want to do this. And they said, go for it, which was great. But it wasn't kind of a traditional academic book, even though California Press did publish it. And so, the idea here is really to explain something that I was observing in Seattle, which was lots and lots of homelessness and no one really understanding why. And we have prevalent narratives about homelessness that if you go to a cocktail party, people are going to tell you. I hear this all the time. And those issues are important, but they are not the sole driver here. So that's kind of the background on me and why I wanted to write this book. That's the book, by the way. And I've been frankly shocked that it caught on. I really wasn't expecting that. And I kind of thought if it did catch on that I would be going to San Francisco to talk about it a little bit and maybe Portland and that would be the end of it. And in fact, what's happened is I've been invited to every corner of the country and a bunch of places around the world to talk about this. And it's been an honor. I'm humbled by it. It's tiring. And it's getting to a point where it's a little concerning because every time I go somewhere, someone will come up to me and say, I'm from Green Bay, Wisconsin. Is there any way you could come to my community and talk about this? I was at the National League of Cities conference in Tampa on Saturday, and this fellow came from a small town south of Kansas City and said, could you come to our community? And I want to say yes to all these, but at some point I can't. And so it just speaks to the need in all these communities that is not being addressed. And we need to disrupt these narratives. And I joke with colleagues that I feel a little bit more like a motivational speaker than a researcher when I come to these communities saying, this is what causes it. And if you want to become Seattle, keep doing what you're doing for the next 10 years. Right. So it's an interesting, for a researcher, kind of an interesting perspective on this. I just got back from Australia. They've got terrible, terrible housing crisis in Australia. They're about 10 years behind our West Coast, I would say. And homelessness is starting to be very prevalent certainly in Melbourne and Sydney. And then Brisbane's hosting the Olympics in 2032. So it's fascinating to kind of see that. And they are deathly afraid of becoming Los Angeles. Everywhere I go, they're like, we don't want to be LA. We don't want to be LA. And I said, well, you better start creating some housing then. And the problem in Brisbane is anyone who builds stuff is building swimming pools and tracks and things. And they're basically gobbling out all of the infrastructure to prepare for the Olympics. So it's been really fascinating to see the international comparisons. And then being in Europe, I was in Budapest at the European Homelessness Conference. And it's just interesting to see, we kind of think about this as inevitable. It's not inevitable. In Northern Europe, rates of homelessness are far, far lower than we have in the United States. They do have homelessness, but it tends to be people with really, really acute challenges. They have a safety net. There are some people who fall through that safety net, and then they have a homeless response system designed to deal with people with those acuities. They're not worrying about people who are serving coffee at Starbucks and experiencing homelessness, right? The social structure takes care of those folks. And so it's just a completely different orientation. So it's interesting. I'm giving a talk in Europe about the market and homelessness, and all of their talks are about substance use and mental illness because that's what they're dealing with. They don't have to worry about the minimum wage worker, whereas here we are. So now we have the homeless response system dealing with people with acute issues, because we do have those in the United States, plus a housing system that's screwed up, right? So the degree of difficulty, if you're thinking about this in a diving sense, is much greater here because we're trying to fix a lot of challenges. So fundamentally, for those of you who are in the social sciences, we have a unit of analysis problem in the study of homelessness. When we think about unit of analysis in social science, it's really thinking about what is the object of the research and the level at which we're trying to explain a phenomenon. So we could have individually focused research where the individual is the unit of analysis. And in that research, we're trying to say, what is the probability of person X to experience an outcome? Or what are the risk factors for that person to experience that? And that's important research. We have a lot of that in homelessness. And then we have a different unit of analysis, which is the city. Why do some cities have more homelessness than others? So frequently what happens is the rest of the world doesn't worry about terms like unit of analysis, thank goodness, because the world's more fun because people don't talk that way. Okay. But it's a real problem because what we've generally done is taken individual units of analysis, ascribed those causes to a community level problem. And what I would describe that as just a square peg in a round hole. So there are also a lot of different ways of knowing about the cause of homelessness. One of them is we ask people who are experiencing homelessness, why are you homeless? Okay. And many times these surveys happen in January when we do the point in time count in most jurisdictions in the United States. The first time I did this was in Minneapolis when I was in graduate school. January in Minneapolis, 2 a.m, walking around really puts things in perspective. Okay? And the survey that I conducted was at a youth and young adult shelter. And the questions that you ask in these interviews are intrusive, to say the least. Right? Have you ever traded sex for a place to live or for a place to stay? And all these young people are saying yes to me. Right? Final question was, if you absolutely had to go home, could you? No, no, no. Why? I'm gay. Brutal. Absolutely brutal. So what happens is we ask these questions and people give us these really blunt answers. Why are you homeless? I'm homeless because I lost my job. Okay, we write that one down. I'm homeless because my boyfriend beat me up. I ran. Now I don't have a place to live. Okay. I made some poor choices. I drink too much. Okay. My roommate kicked me out and here I am. So we honor these explanations. They are causes, right? Who am I to tell someone that that's not why he or she's experiencing homelessness? That would be ridiculous. And so as I was conceptualizing this book in my head, the central concern I had was, how am I going to reconcile Greg coming in with a blue sport coat saying it's the housing market and a woman standing next to me saying it's domestic violence? And so the way that we try to do that in the book is to honor both of those. It's not that one is right and one is wrong. They're both true. They're just explaining different parts of this phenomena. Okay. And so we draw a distinction between what we call root causes and precipitating events. Again, one isn't right, one isn't wrong. They're just two different aspects of a complex phenomenon. And the way that we highlight this distinction is this analogy or metaphor of musical chairs. It's interesting. My co-author Clay Aldern is really smart. He's a Rhodes Scholar, neuroscientist, now is a journalist. Just wrote a book on climate change, its impacts on the brain. Amazing guy. We were debating putting this metaphor in the book, and Clay's vote was no. He's like, it's sophomoric. I was like, that's the point, Clay. So being the first author, I overruled him and said it's going in the book. And the number one feedback that I've gotten on all these tours is this crystallized it for me. And so he's admitted that I was right, which feels good, you know. So anyway, 10 fence, 10 chairs. You know how the game works. Okay, leader starts playing the music. They're walking around a circle, take one chair out. Eventually music stops. Everyone scrambles for a chair. By definition, someone loses. In this case, that person's is Mike. Mike was on crutches after spraining an ankle and therefore wasn't able to move quickly when the music stopped. So if we interview Mike after the game and say, Mike, what caused you? We're back to this word cause again. What caused you to lose the game? What would he say? I had a bad ankle. And everyone would nod in agreement. There would be no dispute about that. Okay. But if we ask a different question and say, like, Mike, why didn't Mike have a chair? It's because we didn't have 10 chairs. The fundamental problem was we just didn't have 10 chairs. If we'd had 10 chairs, he would have hobbled over and found it. It might have taken him longer, but he would have found a chair. And this simple analysis is what happens every single day in Eugene and Portland and Seattle and San Francisco as we walk by Joe on the street and we say, of course, Joe's homeless. He's addicted. Right? And what we're missing in that simple analysis is the structural deficit of housing, and specifically affordable housing, that's creating conditions for people like Joe to experience homelessness. And then we go around and say, we just saw Joe on the street. There's a noodle next to him. There's a drug problem. This happens in every community in the United States. And it then cements an understanding of this phenomenon that is partially correct, but certainly not completely correct. And we therefore end up playing whack-a-mole with all these different explanations, as opposed to saying we fundamentally have to restructure our housing market. Otherwise, we're going to continue to have Joes on the street for time immemorial. Okay. And that's what we're hoping to disrupt with this. I think the other thing on the musical chairs analogy that's really important is when you think about a place like Seattle with Amazon and Microsoft and the wealth that we have, and I know this is a big track and field town, It's like playing musical chairs with Usain Bolt, right? Fastest man in the world. He's going to win every time. The Amazon people are going to win every single time. If you're vulnerable, if you're old and you're playing musical chairs with Usain Bolt, you got no shot. That's exactly what's going on in our cities right now. And it doesn't mean that Usain Bolt or Amazon people are bad. Great. It's fantastic. Go for it. Go for it. But we have to create capacity for other people, not just those who have the greatest means or greatest ability. So what I hope that when you leave tonight, you're not going to go home and say, Greg doesn't think that drug use is a problem or mental illness is a problem. That's not the point of this talk. Okay? Those are conditions that deserve treatment. I think we have a moral obligation to provide treatment. But that alone cannot be the end of the conversation, in my opinion. Okay? If you're addicted, if you're mentally ill, if you're poor, you're more likely to experience homelessness. At the individual unit of analysis, that's true. We can fill this room with research demonstrating that. Well, we also know that people have those conditions in every city in the United States. And in some places, we have lots of homelessness and others don't. So we should want to understand why that is. So the fundamental question that we pose in the book is a really simple one, which is, why do rates of homelessness vary so widely throughout the United States? Why does my home city of Seattle have 5 times the homelessness of Chicago? Okay, massive variation. And the purpose of asking that question is that we can provide a credible answer to that question. It should then allow us to focus our time, attention, and resources on that issue, rather than playing whack-a-mole with 15 different explanations. And an obvious answer to that question, of the regional variation question, is if you take all the individual factors and you have more people with those individual risk factors in a city, you'll have more homelessness. That makes perfect sense. You would get an A in a logic class for making that argument. It turns out it's not true. Okay? And it doesn't stop a lot of people, including people at very high levels of the federal government, making this argument. So this is a book about cities. It's not a book about people. And this doesn't mean that person-focused research isn't important, and folks experiencing homelessness don't deserve our attention and focus and respect. They absolutely do, but that's not what this book is. This book is explaining what the heck is going on in Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, Boston, DC. That's what this book is. And the thesis is that tight housing markets accentuate individual vulnerability and produce homelessness at much higher levels. And these individual attributes that receive disproportionate attention in the newspaper and in social settings are really sorting mechanisms. They're helping to identify the people who are going to experience homelessness when housing is scarce. So if I'm going to write a book about regional variation, I want to demonstrate for you, in fact, that we do have huge regional variation. For those of you who are familiar with homelessness data, it's imprecise. And so it's important to take any data on numbers of homelessness with a grain of salt, because it's just very hard to count accurately these populations. And so the way I describe these data is, this is directionally correct, right? But I certainly wouldn't stake my career on the fact that this being the precise measurement of homelessness in each of these jurisdictions. So a quick discussion of bureaucratic nuance, which is important in the study of homelessness. Many journalists mess this up and then start to compare apples to oranges and can reach incorrect conclusions. So some places count homelessness at the city level. New York City, for example. Their estimate of homelessness is just for the city. So New York, DC, San Francisco, Boston do that. Other places, like Lane County and Multnomah County and King County, count at the county level. Neither way is right or wrong. It's just that's the way they've chosen to do it. Because homelessness congregates in the urban core, county-based, they're called COCs, continuums of care, will tend to have lower rates of homelessness because you're including suburban locations where homelessness is less prevalent. So what we can't do is compare a county to a city and then say, look, the city has more homelessness. That's bad analysis. So our samples are the 30 largest metros in the United States, and we need to break it up by where we count by at the city level and where we count at the county level. So in the cities in our sample, we have New York, DC, San Francisco, and Boston, which have about 10 people per 1,000 experiencing homelessness. Okay, and that's about 5 times Indianapolis and Chicago, which are about 2 per capita. Okay? Huge variation. It's not 20%, 30%, it's 5 times. When we go to counties, the numbers are lower for the reasons I indicated before, but what's fascinating is the relationship is still 5 to 1. LA County, Santa Clara County, King County, Multnomah are between 5 and 6, and Hillsborough County, which is Tampa, is about 1. Okay. And in 2019, when I did this, York County was 5.7. So you were clustered right up there with the big four, unfortunately. And your numbers have actually grown since then. And so you have a very, very high per capita count for a county-based COC, especially a county of this size. Okay. So this is what we're going to try to explain using pretty simple statistics. And the logic of the book is we just test all the conventional explanations. Does this help us understand regional variation? If it doesn't, we cross it off and we move to the next one. And we just make our way through the book doing that. And I'm not going to go through all of them tonight because you have other things you want to do. But you'll get at least a flavor for it. Okay, so first, we have poverty. Of course, homelessness is a poverty problem. I would never suggest otherwise. If you're poor, you're more likely to experience homelessness. Okay, but we didn't name the book that because what's interesting is when you change the unit of analysis and instead look at rates of poverty in a community, what you see is there's actually a negative relationship. Places with really high rates of poverty, Cleveland, Detroit, St. Louis, tend to have far lower rates of homelessness than very affluent cities. Right? The 3 richest cities in the United States, Seattle, San Francisco, and Boston, also have the highest rates of homelessness. So homelessness thrives amidst affluence, not amidst poverty. We cannot blame the homelessness crisis in Seattle on disproportionate numbers of people who are poor. We actually have fewer. But do we have some poor people? Of course we do. The point of this slide is not that poverty doesn't matter. The point of the slide is being poor in an affluent place has very different consequences. That's the point of the slide. Okay. Detroit, for all of its problems, and they are numerous, homelessness isn't one of them. Okay. Why? Because there's some housing. They're in fact tearing down housing in Detroit, right? Because they've lost 30% of their population over the last 50 years. When people leave, the housing doesn't leave. Okay. So this is the part of the program where people's blood pressure starts to rise a little bit. So if you find yourself in that camp, it's okay. You can just take a deep breath. Okay. Greg, how dare you suggest this isn't a drug problem? I've gotten a variation of that email many, many, many times over the last 2.5 years. Okay. So this is data from the federal government on rates of serious mental illness, and this is state level data. The drug and mental illness data are better at the state than at the community level. So I zoom out to the state. But this is state levels. So this is state per capita rates of homelessness relative to rates of mental illness in that state. And what you'll see here, for those of you who have taken basic statistics, is this is basically a nothing burger. There's nothing going on here, statistically speaking. There's no relationship. There are people experiencing serious mental illness in every state in the nation, and there is some variation in that rate, and it bears zero relationship to rates of homelessness. Okay. So the problem in California, Oregon, and California is not that we have disproportionate numbers of people experiencing mental illness. It's just the context in which that mental illness occurs is a problem. Doesn't mean that mental illness isn't a problem. Doesn't mean that it doesn't deserve treatment, right? I think generally speaking, Washington is as guilty of this as anyone. Our response to the mental health crisis has been inadequate. The number of beds we have is grossly inadequate to the scale of the problem, which is a separate problem from the one that we're talking about tonight. But it's related. It's certainly related. This is substance use disorders. Again, R-squared of 0.06 is basically nothing. There are people using and abusing drugs in every jurisdiction in the United States. This is inconsistent with the personal experience of walking down 3rd Avenue in Seattle and seeing Joe with a needle next to him, which then frustrates people. Okay. So when people push back, I'll say, do you think people use drugs in Chicago? I lived there for 8 years. People use drugs in Chicago. I can confirm that. Do you think people use drugs in West Virginia? The highest overdose death rate in the United States is in West Virginia. An absolute tragedy. If that were fundamentally the cause of this crisis, we should see a massive amount of homelessness in West Virginia, but we don't. So is drugs part of the story here? Of course. Of course, there's an interaction between the two. But if this were fundamentally driven by drugs, we should see a ton of homelessness in Tennessee and West Virginia and Arkansas and Mississippi. We don't. Black, brown, indigenous people are 3 to 4 times overrepresented in the homeless population. We have massive racial disparities in homelessness. So let's see if race helps us understand this regional variation point. This is the homelessness plotted against the percentage of the population that identifies as Black or African American in each of these cities and counties. And what you'll see is there's either no relationship or a negative relationship between the two. Okay. Well, Greg, you just told us that there are huge racial disparities. How do I explain this? The way I explain it is that race doesn't cause homelessness. Being black doesn't cause homelessness. If it did, Chicago would have a lot more homelessness than Seattle. Much higher black population in Chicago than Seattle. Okay. The point of this slide is that race doesn't cause homelessness, racism causes homelessness. Racism helps to explain why Black, brown, and indigenous people are grossly overrepresented in the homeless population in Seattle and in Portland, and I would assume in Lane County, in Jackson, Mississippi, and Boston, Massachusetts. And there are the structural disparities in housing and healthcare and education and criminal justice and for the last 300-400 years helps to explain why we have these disparities. Okay, the mere demographic makeup of a city doesn't explain it. So we still don't have a good answer to the question that we posed, which is why do we have this regional variation? We've crossed all these off. We have to keep hunting. Okay, this I describe as the cocktail party portion of the conversation, which usually happens with me holding a glass of red wine and people lecturing me on the causes of homelessness. Okay, and so part of this section of the book was driven by all these conversations that I've had over and over and over, and I just smile and nod and take a drink. Okay, Greg, LA is warm, Chicago's cold. Of course, LA is, you'd want to be homeless in LA. End of story. Okay. The West Coast is mild, Greg. I was like, well, I got off the plane last night and it was 41 degrees and rainy. This is not pleasant at all. Right? You want to be homeless in Eugene or Seattle? Come on. Okay, is LA warmer than Chicago? Yes, it is. That's true. But you know what else is warm? It's Florida and Texas and Arizona. And they don't have anywhere near the rates of homelessness. You know what else is cold? Is Boston. And they have among the highest rates of homelessness in the United States. Okay. So we want to blame Mother Nature. We love to blame someone else. We can't blame Mother Nature. Okay. For those of you who are astute observers of this, the numbers we're using in this is the total homeless population, which is people who are in shelter as well as people who are unsheltered, living in places, as HUD would describe it or define it, as unfit for human habitation. Cars, tents, on the street, whatever the case may be. Okay. There is a correlation between weather and unsheltered homelessness. Okay. Colder jurisdictions in the East Coast and in Minneapolis, my hometown, tend to have very robust shelter systems. They have right to shelter laws. And part of that might have been a result of difficult weather. And so what you'll see is far less visible homelessness in New York, Boston, and DC than you see in Seattle, San Francisco, Portland, and LA. Okay. In the West Coast, let's just say roughly speaking 50-50. Half the people experiencing homelessness are on the streets. And therefore, there is a correlation between visible homelessness and weather, which contributes to people's understanding of this. But it's really important when we think about this, just getting people into shelter doesn't reduce homelessness, it just recharacterizes it. When people come back to Seattle and say, Greg, I was just in New York and they don't have a problem with homelessness, I'll say they have the biggest problem with homelessness in the United States. They just hide it. And so is there a role for shelter? Absolutely. But my hope, and when I talk to elected leaders all around the country, I'll say, New York 2.0 shouldn't be our goal. New York, that shelter system has consumed billions and billions and billions of dollars over the last 25 years. And they basically created a system that warehouses people, many times for years and decades. Okay. And they aren't terribly pleasant places to be. The reason they've done that is they have no place to put people. They just keep in that shelter system. There's nowhere for them to go. So is that better than being on the street? Maybe yes, maybe no. That's a topic for another day, but that can't be our only solution. Okay. Myth number 2. Greg, people are moving here to experience homelessness. If we weren't so generous, people would stop moving here to experience homelessness. So I first heard this in Minneapolis when I was in graduate school, and people were blaming folks from Chicago for the homelessness crisis in Minneapolis. We actually studied a little bit and found no evidence of that. So I moved to Seattle. Literally in my first meeting in Seattle, someone said, well, you know, we're a magnet for homelessness because we're very generous. I said, that's interesting. That's what Minneapolis said. I said, where are your folks coming from? They're coming from California. I said, okay. So then I'm in meetings in California and they said, you know, we're a magnet for homelessness in California. I said, you can't be. You're shipping your people to Seattle. Okay. I said, where are your people coming from? This is my favorite. Where are your people coming from, California? Texas. Okay. We love to blame Texas, and Texas deserves some blame now and again. But we even mentioned in the book Middletown, Ohio, which believed that it was a magnet for homelessness. Middletown, Ohio, right? This you read about all the time, the massive homelessness problem in Middletown, Ohio. I'm sure they're lovely people, but it's kind of like, come on. So this narrative is super prevalent, but that's not how magnets work. Like everyone can't be the recipient, right? So this is TANF, which is the primary federal welfare program for families and children. It's typically women and children. This came into being in '96 under Clinton's welfare reform. And one of the attributes of this policy was huge state-to-state variation. So we have some states that are stingy, some that are generous. And so we actually can test and see, are people congregating in states with generous benefits? And the answer to that question is no. And this doesn't mean that generous benefits aren't good. I actually support generous welfare benefits. But keep in mind, generous welfare benefits are not terribly generous, right? It's stingy to a little less stingy, to be clear, right? You're not going, buying lobster dinners with this money, despite other narratives. So the point here is that we don't have people making 1,000-mile moves to optimize their welfare outcomes. Okay, why? Because moving is hard. And so we moved a family of 4 here in 2017. Natalie Pfeiffer's here, used to live a block from us in Minnesota. That move was hard, right? We were leaving people who loved and cared for us. New job, new schools. We had no friends. Had to find a house in Seattle. Talk about a nightmare. Okay. And we had every advantage under the sun. Now imagine doing that with nothing. Are you going to leave your mom who watches your kids when you go to work, move across the country for cheaper housing or better welfare benefits? No. These social networks are super important to all of us. They become really important if you have nothing. Okay. So this idea, when people say like, Greg, why don't they just leave? People say this to me all the time about folks in Seattle. I'm like, why should they have to leave? This has been their home for a long time. We priced them out and now they have to leave? Doesn't seem right. Doesn't stop people from making this argument all the time. So there is a lot of residential mobility among low-income folks because they tend to be renters and leases are 1 year, but it tends to be local mobility. So very high local mobility, but very low state-to-state mobility because of the challenges with moving. Okay, politics. We have a Democratic mayor here, I think. Nonpartisan mayor. Okay, I apologize. So President Trump and Governor Gavin Newsom of California got in a big fight about this. Okay, our mayor in Seattle is partisan, is a Democrat, has been for a long time. So Trump's saying, listen, we've got Democrats running cities on the West Coast, which is a true statement, and we've got West Coast cities with tons of homelessness. Therefore, right, Governor Newsom was not a big fan of this argument, right? And Governor Newsom, fires back and says the federal government has done us no favors for the last 40 years in terms of housing policy, and that's a true statement. But neither of these arguments are really valid because if it's just the federal government retrenchment, we shouldn't have massive variation. So Newsom's not really right. And Trump's point that Democrats run these cities also fails to account for the fact that Democrats also run Cleveland and Detroit and St. Louis and Baltimore and Philadelphia. But there are basically 3 major cities that have had Republican mayors: San Diego, Indianapolis, and Miami. And Bloomberg was an independent when he was mayor of New York. Otherwise, it's all Democrats. So it's not that Democrats get a free pass, but this idea of permissive left-leaning governors causing this crisis doesn't really hold up to scrutiny. All right, so we've crossed off all these other explanations. And as you might have suspected, we're now going to get to something that has a little bit more significance here, and that is median contract rents. Okay, where rents are high, homelessness is high. Okay, there's no Nobel Prize coming for this analysis. Okay, we've known this for a long time, but for whatever reason, this has not made it into the consciousness at all. A related variable is rental market vacancy rates. So urban economists have taught us that basically 5% is kind of the neutral point for a vacancy rate in a market. It's like unemployment rates. Unemployment can never go to 0, right? Because you leave your job and then your chair is empty for a little bit, and that's just the nature of a dynamic system. So we have a natural rate of unemployment. We also have a natural rate of vacancy in the rental market. And they've said it's basically 5, 6%, something like that. So below 5 or 6% would suggest that you have a deficit of rental housing. And I want you to keep this in the back of your mind because we're going to get to your numbers in about 5 minutes. Okay. So below 5% would suggest you have a deficit of rental housing. And what you'll see in this graph is when you get below 5%, what happens? You have higher rates of homelessness. And we know, and vacancy rates cause rent increases. So these are related, not independent variables. But basically, every place in the United States that has high rents and low vacancies has a problem with homelessness. Is it perfect? Is a perfect explanation? No, but it's a heck of a lot better than all the other stuff I hear when I'm drinking red wine. Okay. So we should really want to understand then, if this is a problem, if housing market conditions are a problem, why do they exist? Why do they exist in some places and not others? Is it simply because these cities are destinations where people want to live? In Seattle, is it because of Amazon? Certainly part of the story, right? It has created a massive boom in our city. But what's interesting is when you plot the population growth over the time period of our analysis and rates of homelessness, you see no relationship. This really, really surprised me. In fact, I reran this 3 times. So I was like, I think I did something wrong here because I was expecting to see a relationship and there wasn't. So what I then did is went into each of these dots. I'm like, well, what am I missing here? And what I realized, there are a bunch of places that are growing really fast in the United States that don't have a problem with homelessness. Well, let's look at those then. And what that got me to was I was only focused on the demand side of housing, which is certainly important. More people, more income creates more demand for housing. But what I was ignoring with this analysis is the supply side of housing. So if you took economics at some point in your life, elasticity might be kind of a evil word or a word that doesn't elicit real fond memories, but it doesn't have to be scary. Okay. Elasticity is just an economic term. So supply elasticity is just measuring how responsive the supply of a good is to a change in price. So if this clicker goes up 10 times in price tonight, the people who manufacture these clickers are going to have some champagne tonight and celebrate. And then tomorrow, what are they going to do? They're going to make a whole bunch of these. They're going to go to 2 shifts or 3 shifts. And pretty soon we would see the store shelves flooded with these things. It's a very elastic good. The supply is elastic. If the price of housing in Eugene goes up 10 times tonight, what happens to supply in the next week? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Why? It takes a while to build housing. I need land. I need permits. I need financing. I need labor. I need materials. So generally speaking, housing isn't a terribly elastic good. And we also know from urban economists that there is different elasticity in different markets. Some places build more housing than others. And the 2 drivers of elasticity are the regulatory environment, how easy or difficult is it to build housing, and topography. If you have mountains and water, it's harder to build more housing. If you combine strict regulation and challenging topography, you end up with a really inelastic housing market. San Francisco, California. 2 years to get a permit to build housing right now in San Francisco. People are dying on the streets, 2 years. And I'm not anti-regulation. I want my ground beef to be safe. I want people to live in safe housing, but there has to be a reasonable middle ground between appropriate regulation and waiting 2 years when we desperately need more housing. Okay, that has gotten a little bit out of whack in many places, and particularly on the West Coast. And this is why I say, like, there are elected leaders who are Democrats and don't get a free pass because they have presided over the last 2 decades when we had a massive population growth and we didn't build enough housing. And part of that is because the regulatory environment was really challenging. And there's more pressure on those elected leaders because the topography of these cities is accentuating that. The cruel irony is the beauty of Seattle, which is drawing people there, also makes it harder for us to accommodate the people who want to go there because of the beauty, right? It's this kind of vicious cycle. And then you throw on a couple massive, trillion-dollar companies on top of it, and then now you got a real problem. And so when you think about the cities that are having these challenges, you layer a tech boom on top of a really inelastic housing market, and you end up with a massive, massive housing crisis and an associated crisis of homelessness. So it's tragic. It really is, but it's 100% predictable. And what's frustrating about Seattle is we watched San Francisco go through this ahead of us. And we patted ourselves in the back and said, well, we're not San Francisco, and now we are. We didn't learn. And so when I travel around the country, I joke, I said, I'm like a Charles Dickens character, the ghost of Christmas to come, which is you can sit on your hands and in 10 years you can be Seattle and you're not going to be happy about it. It's a heck of a lot easier to deal with things now than waiting 10 years. Okay? That's an easier message to deliver in Iowa than it is in Eugene because you're kind of in the mess with us right now. So if we think about the supply and demand of housing, the way I want you to think about this slide is the x-axis, the bottom axis is change in population. Think about that as a proxy for housing demand. More people, more demand for housing. The y-axis, the vertical axis, is supply elasticity. Numbers above 1 suggest more elastic housing markets. The higher the number, the more housing you built. Less than 1 would suggest inelastic housing. And so what's interesting about this, I love this slide. I can just spend hours talking about it. But the numbers in parentheses are the rental market vacancy rates during the decade of the 2010s. So the upper right-hand quadrant to me is super fascinating, which is places that have grown just as fast as Seattle and San Francisco and Boston, but have not had the same experience with a housing crisis. Why is that? Because they have a really elastic housing market. They have created housing and accommodated their growth better than coastal cities have. And you can see those vacancy rates are 9, 8, right? Much, much higher than what you see in the coasts. And so I'm in the unusual situation of I'm typically not advocating for Texas-style policymaking just because of my ideology. But in this case, what they've done is they've demonstrated that if you build units, you can accommodate growth. And they probably built those units through sprawl and maybe some other approaches that we might not find that interesting. But ultimately, the point is that supply does matter. Okay. They could have built the supply in a different way, and that's topic for another book. But the point is that you can accommodate growth, and they did so. The bottom right-hand quadrant is the problem, right? It is really, really dynamic, fast-growing cities that haven't built much housing. And what happens? You end up with a really, really tight housing market. 3% vacancy rates over a decade is highly, highly problematic. It is basically like just squeezing the tension on this housing market. What happens? Rents do this. So we have to avoid that as much as possible. So what's happened since? Our data ended in 2019. And since then, we've had a global pandemic, which disrupted life in many ways. It also messed up our data. So it's really important when we talk about homelessness counts in that time period is to really take them with a grain of salt. Because some places didn't count some years, some places just did a sheltered count. So 20, 21, well, 21 and 22 in particular, you just have to, in essence, kind of throw them out the door. Okay. But with the 23 data and now the 24 data that's starting to come out now, there are a few takeaways. One is the logic of the book holds. Good news if you wrote the book, bad news if you care about humanity. Okay. We still have our problem children on the coast, but unfortunately what's happening is we're seeing similar dynamics in places like Phoenix and Austin and Sacramento and Atlanta and Denver. Really, really tight, expensive housing markets, and homelessness is starting to creep up. I spoke at the Housing Iowa conference in Cedar Rapids, Iowa last year sometime, and I ran this data ahead of time. The state of Iowa has a 5% vacancy rate. I would have literally bet my entire net worth that it was 8 or 9%. So the fact that the state of Iowa has a problematic vacancy rate is a massive, like, flashing red light of we've got a big problem. One of the fun things about this tour is I just get to meet a lot of interesting people. I was in Atlanta speaking at a conference, and Sean Donovan was there also speaking, who was Obama's HUD secretary. He's now CEO of Enterprise, which is a big housing and community development organization. He and I were chatting, and he said, well, you've been all over. What have you heard? And I told him, and he said, well, I'm hearing the exact same thing. And he ran housing in New York City before he went to the federal government. So he's been doing this for 30 years. He said that this is the most problematic housing market he's seen across the United States in his entire career. And that gave me goosebumps when that happened, because there's probably not many people in the United States who understand housing better than Sean Donovan. Okay. So this is not just a Eugene and Seattle problem. It is all over the place. So it was interesting when I was at Cedar Rapids, I many times will just go out for a run in the morning, and it's a good way to see cities. And I was giving an interview to a local journalist who said, did you see all the homelessness? And I almost started laughing, coming from Seattle. I said, well, I saw 1 or 2 people. And he was really, really concerned. And I realized for them, they've gone from 0 to all of a sudden they're starting to see people, and that's a huge concern for them. So I had to kind of reorient myself to say, like, well, you don't know what you're talking about. But going from 0 to something is an issue, and that's happening all over the place, which is why communities are starting to pay attention to this. So this summer, if you've been following the news on homelessness, there was a case out of Oregon called the Grants Pass v. Johnson, which went to the Supreme Court. It deals with the criminalization of homelessness. And I signed on to a bunch of amicus briefs on this, and there was all sorts of response from the research community talking about, 1, the causes of homelessness, and 2, the troubling counterproductive outcomes associated with criminalization. And they didn't ignore that, but they basically ignored it and said, no, we're gonna give a green light to this. Okay. If you're interested in this, the deliberations, which you can listen to, was absolutely fascinating. It was really, I spent 3 hours listening to it. It was really, really interesting. and just the fundamental misunderstandings of some of the justices of homelessness was really concerning. But anyway, so what happened? So we now have given a green light to jurisdictions to criminalize homelessness. And one of the more troubling images after this decision was Gavin Newsom, who was wearing jeans and a t-shirt, throwing people's stuff into a trash truck as he was cleaning up an encampment. We know that those sweeps are really problematic because what happens? We throw people's driver's licenses away, their birth certificates, all these things, family pictures, they're gone. And so now trying to get a job without ID becomes much harder. We know that finding people and citing them makes getting housing and a job that much harder. So if the goal is to reduce homelessness, the worst thing that we can do is pursue aggressive criminalization. And I fear very, very much that that's where we're going. And I understand people's frustration. As I was at HUD last month talking to senior leaders of HUD, and I just said, listen, my social circle in Seattle are people who voted for Obama, Biden, and probably Harris. And I can tell you what I'm hearing from them is get these people out of here. And if we've lost that segment of the electorate, we're in deep, deep trouble. And so this is going to be a real challenge for local elected leaders all around the country over the next 4 years. My fear is that we're going to start rounding people up and putting them into camps, and we don't have a great history of that working out well in human history. A lot of states are pursuing legislation, particularly in the South, anti-criminalization bills. Oklahoma has one, and it was interesting. This journalist apparently had read the book and was interviewing Representative Weaver, who is the author of this bill, and said, do you feel like homelessness is a housing problem? And Representative Weaver responded, it could be. I mean, it could be if they don't have any place to live. Okay. And so this is the person who wants to criminalize homelessness in the state of Oklahoma, right? So we've got a lot of work. We've got a lot of work to do. All right, so what's going on at home for you? So you count homelessness at the county level. So I grabbed the county level data here, but I also ran the city data, and it's basically the same story. Okay, your rents have gone up 59% over the last 10 years. You're at about 1,400 at the county, and I think the city number I was looking at the other day is even higher than that. And this is from the American Community Survey, which is put out by the U.S. Census. Okay, your vacancy rates, this really surprised me. Not as much as Iowa, but it did surprise me. You have incredibly low vacancy rates. You've been hovering at 2-3%. That is dangerously low. That's lower than Seattle. Your rent increases are not a surprise when you see those vacancy rates. That is just like an accelerant for the rental market. Okay, hovering below 5% for the length of time that you have is really, really problematic. And so unless that line starts to go up, and listen, if you own housing, rental housing, this is a good market for you. I understand that. I'm in the Department of Real Estate. Okay. But from a societal perspective, those are really, really problematic. So Seattle, we built a bunch of studios and one bedrooms. Our vacancy rate just shot up to 8%, which is great. We've been at 3% for the last decade. And I was at City Hall and they were complaining about vacancy. I was like, hey, stop. We've been praying for vacancy for the last 10 years. And yeah, if you own a building right now, it kind of sucks, but you're doing fine. Okay. In 3 years, we're going to be worried much more about low vacancies. So now we have no deliveries coming on because of interest rates and everything that's been going on the last couple of years. And so there's this delicate balance of what is a good level of vacancy, and we need private developers to build, and they don't want to have a lot of vacancies. So this is hard, but this is not healthy. Right? And if this persists, I'd love to be wrong, but I think your homelessness problem is going to continue to get worse, including the guy who's going to take me to the airport tomorrow. So one of the things that I hear a lot from people who are skeptical of this argument is, Greg, we spent X million, X $100 million, X $1 billion on homelessness, and the problem has gotten worse. Why would we continue to make these investments? And I understand people's frustration with money that is perceived to not be effective. So I take issue with it for two reasons. One is the scale of these investments, although significant, have been woefully inadequate to the scale of the crisis. Okay, I was at UCLA giving a talk. They passed Prop HHH a few years ago, which was $1 billion, $1.2 billion for homelessness response. Fantastic. Biggest local commitment in the United States. What happened? Homelessness got way worse. People were complaining about that. And I said, well, you have a $50 billion problem. You threw $1 billion at it, and now you're mad that it didn't go away. The reality is that $1 billion did a lot of good. Got a lot of people housed, built a lot of housing, probably saved a lot of lives. It was just insufficient to the scale of the problem. So throwing that out makes zero sense, in my opinion. Doesn't stop people from making that argument. Okay. The other thing that's important about our investments in homelessness is within the United States, the vast majority of dollars that are invested in homelessness are into a response to the crisis. We call it the crisis response system. Shelters are part of that crisis response system. It is wonderful work. It is much needed work. It saves lives, but it's not meant to end homelessness. What it's meant to do is care for people when they lose their housing. Okay. And it really frustrates me when we then blame the homeless response system for being inefficient and not ending homelessness. We don't blame ER doctors for people continuing to break their arms. We would never suggest like, this ER is terrible. People keep breaking their arms. It's the same argument we make all the time about homelessness. Right? What do we do about broken arms? So like my trampoline when I was a kid had no of those walls. The trampoline my kids had the side stuff. Why? Because kids were breaking their arms. So we did something about it, right? If we want fewer people to enter the crisis response system, let's do something about it. We need to have more housing for folks. Otherwise, they're going to continue to come in. LA, who gets a terrible rap nationwide, does an unbelievable job of getting people rehoused out of their crisis response system. Like 25,000 people over the last couple of years. At the same time, like 35 or 40,000 people entered homelessness. And then the LA Times writes a story and says homelessness went up by 15,000 people in LA. That's true. The math is true. But what it's masking is all this great success that they've had. We cannot allow that flow to continue at this rate. We have to move upstream and create more housing. It's just like a bathtub. If the water's coming in faster than it's going out the drain, the water level is going to rise. That's what the LA story is. Their drain actually works pretty well, but it is no match for the flow of water that's coming into that bathtub. And so when we start to talk about housing capacity, we need to start thinking about some of these difficult issues like, well, where are we going to build the housing? Not on my block. And I like the character of my neighborhood the way it is right now. Okay? And all of you who are in local government, I met a number of you tonight, you know this better than I do, right? These battles are fought every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. Okay? A great book. I won't assign reading, but if you're interested, you have a holiday, gift ideas. Neighborhood Defenders, written by Katie Einstein. She's at Boston University. She wrote this based on her dissertation when she was at Harvard. She went to Cambridge City Council meetings and basically looked at all the debates around multifamily housing. And the thesis of the book is that on Tuesday night, who shows up at 7 o'clock? A bunch of people look like me. They're over 50 years old. They're white. They're single-family homeowners. They got nothing better to do except show up to these meetings and say no. And in the New England democracy, the city council or planning commission says, well, 5 people showed up. They all said no, so no housing. And then we do that night after night after night in every city in the United States, and we end up with a screwed up housing system. Like, well, how do we end up here? Because of that. So when people say, like, Greg, what can I do as an individual? I usually say 2 things. 1, you should vote. And vote for people who support policies that are important around housing. But maybe even more importantly is show up on Tuesday night and say we need this housing. Because the problem is who gets invited to these meetings? It's people in the close vicinity of that project. If you would benefit from multifamily housing, but you can't afford to live there right now, you're not even invited to the meeting. So we have basically privileged people with immense privilege already by inviting them to the meeting and determining what neighborhoods look like. Okay. So that's a really interesting, from an academic perspective, a really interesting area of research, which is how do we think about the small d democratic process and civic engagement to make sure that we're representing all voices, not just those who have nothing better to do on Tuesday night. Okay. And to be clear, I live in a single family home, right? So I'm as guilty as anyone. Okay. But I am not going to those meetings and say no, to be clear. Okay, so who should do this? We finished the book with 3 tensions that really make this difficult. And I have a little more time tonight, so I'm going to go into these because I think they're important. One of the tensions is the short versus long-term tension, which is if you're the mayor of Seattle right now, people are really, really angry at the level of homelessness. And if you stand up and say, my solution is to build housing and in 20 years, we're going to be great. Right? Mayor Hill probably won't get reelected. So there's a real temptation, but it's also, it's basically a demand to do something in the short term. And because we can't build housing in the short term, what are we going to do? Let's round them up. And so this is this short versus long-term tension, which is why I do believe there's a role for more shelter. I believe there's a role for temporary solutions to alleviate the unsheltered crisis that we have in our cities. But we also have to do the long-term at the same time. Otherwise, we just end up with the New York system with a massive short-term response that just exists in perpetuity. Who should build this? Who should do this? Is it a public problem or a private problem? All the above, I would argue. Okay. I firmly believe 99% of the housing in the United States is built without subsidy. You might like that system or hate it. I'm not a huge fan of it, but that's the reality. So if we want more housing, if we've got a $3 or $4 million deficit of housing in the United States, private developers are going to build most of that. I firmly believe it should be easier, quicker, and cheaper for private developers to build more housing. Greg, you're and then I'll get accused of being a sheriff for corporate interest when I make that argument. Okay. I will also then say that there are going to be a lot of people in this country who won't be able to afford that housing. And therefore, there is a role for government to ensure that other people can afford housing. And then people call me a socialist. Okay. I don't think either of those are true, but that's fine. That's fine. So the point is like this is a complex thing. We need to activate both the public and private sector around these issues. One of them alone will not fix this. Okay. Who should do this? If local or federal government? Yes. Okay. We were just at HUD and two colleagues and me had to write a 3-page paper, which is kind of funny, to the Secretary of HUD saying, how do we end homelessness in the United States? Okay. Any other things you'd like me to do? And basically we said, listen, we're not going to end homelessness without federal action. We just aren't. They have the deepest pockets by far. Doesn't mean that states and counties and cities shouldn't act and do everything you possibly can. But 1 in 4 people, 1 in 5 people who are eligible for federal housing support actually get it. The other 4 and 5 come to mayors and county commissioners saying, I need help and housing's expensive. And that's a huge burden on local government and state government. Okay. I'm not confident over the next 4 years we're going to get a lot of help from DC. And so it's going to put increasing pressure on states and localities. That's just a reality. All right. So my hope with this book is that we would take some attention away from Joe on the street. And not because Joe doesn't deserve our care and dignity. It's because it's too easy to blame Joe. If I walk by Joe on my way to work in Seattle and say, boy, I feel bad for Joe. But Joe made some poor decisions, it absolves me of responsibility. Right? If instead I see Joe as a consequence of structure that I, Greg Colburn, have contributed to and that we've all contributed to over our lifetimes, it then forces us to look in the mirror at the end of the day when we're brushing our teeth saying, well, what am I going to do? What are we collectively going to do? And that's scary because it's a heck of a lot easier to just blame Joe. And structural problems are there for a reason because it's hard to change structure. It requires political will and resources and courage and all these things that are in short supply. Well, we have to do it. And so finally, people will say, Greg, I'm not sure that housing's going to help Joe. He's a mess. Right? People have said those exact words to me. And what I'll say is, I'm confident that it will because we literally just did it. And so my dad's generation, Vietnam generation, it was typically men coming back from Vietnam were grossly overrepresented in the homeless population. It was kind of a national scar. Right? I think as a nation, we didn't feel good about the way we treated people coming back from Vietnam. And so now the next generation of warriors come back from Iraq and Afghanistan. We have men and women coming back and we said, let's not repeat that mistake. Fantastic. Leaders of both political parties said, let's make sure that we reduce homelessness among veterans. Great. I'm all for it. My dad's a veteran, grandpa's a veteran. They deserve our focus and attention. And what happened? We put money through the VA and HUD and we cut veteran homelessness by 50% in 10 years. A massive achievement. What I said to the secretary when I was at HUD, I just said, I don't think this is a time for humility, right? You need to be pounding your chest about this achievement because most people don't understand that we literally just did this. The playbook exists to end homelessness in the United States. We've just decided not to extend that playbook to people who didn't serve in the military. And why? Because housing veterans is good politics. Let's just call it what it is. I'm grateful they did it, and it's an amazing test case. We just have chosen not to extend that logic more broadly, and we're living with the consequences. So these debates about whether these interventions, whether housing and services and housing first work, to me is foolish. We literally just did it. And this is a population of people who had very serious behavioral health disorders, right? Some people just needed a voucher, a little purchasing power, and other people needed really intensive services. And it worked. It worked. So my hope is that your community and my community and all the communities around the United States will recognize some of these fundamental issues and make different decisions than we've made in the past. Otherwise, we're going to continue to fight the same challenges. I kind of joke like this is sort of like talking to a toddler, since if you continue to make the same decisions, you're going to get the same results. That's what we've done as a nation. And hopefully the nation listens better than my toddlers did when they were little. Okay. So thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Greg. And he is going to grab some water so that we can get into the Q&A that we have time for this evening. Um, it's such a wonderful experience to feel your mind opened by new information. And it's also not everyone in the world who finds statistical information that accessible. So I've been really grateful to Greg for a number of years, but also in other presentations for how accessible he makes this for us. We have a few questions, and I know a few people who have maybe prepared some questions, and we'll probably have time for maybe 7 or 8, depending on how succinct those answers can be. So, first question, I'm looking at Rebecca Lewis right now, who is one of the directors of our planning school at the University of Oregon. And Rebecca, I'm wondering if I give you a microphone, if you could ask Greg this question. Right. Come on back up. And we can sit down over here.
I'm trying to see if I can move it.
Is this on?
Okay. So 3 p.m. is. Hope I didn't break anything. So 3 p.m. is really applied, and our students and faculty talk a lot about how we focus on solutions instead of problems. So there's a lot of students in the room, there are a lot of alums in the room who are working in this space. So what advice do you have to them to use the skills and knowledge that they have to make a difference and help solve this problem?
Well, I think one of the interesting thing is we spent most of the time in this book trying to properly diagnose the problem. And we have a final chapter or two that are talking about solutions, but it's pretty high level stuff. And so what's interesting is we've had more success convincing people of the problem. And then people said, well, I need the solution, Greg. It's like, well, that wasn't really the point of the book. And so we're going to write a follow-up, which is more focused on that because it's hard to get all of that into one book. But I do think that properly diagnosing these problems is fundamental because if you don't do that, then you end up playing whack-a-mole and you're just doing all this other stuff and then you don't get progress. And so it's easy to jump into solutions because it's very tempting because I want to act, I want to make a difference. But if we're fixing the wrong thing or have misidentified the problem, so we gotta back up, make sure we get that straight. And then with a kind of cohesive idea, if that's our problem, how are we going to fix that? And that's when people's training can come in to figure out like, how do we do that then? And that's complicated, right? If it was easy, we would have done it. But at least now we're working in the right direction.
I'll get on.
Oh, that was what fell down there. I was wondering if it was the microphone that landed behind the stage. I have an immediate follow-up question, but it might be related to something that I was talking with another member of Better Housing Editors Board about, Betsy Schultz. Going to put you on the spot and ask if you have a question for Greg, maybe about that next body of research. Yeah, or feel free.
Yeah, so thank you so much for coming. We so appreciate it. I guess I'm curious if you can go into what the topic of the next book will be, and if when you go into, looking at the data around the larger cities, are you going to also do mid-size that Eugene is, and kind of are there specific unique challenges that you're seeing there?
Yeah. So one of the things that's been interesting is I feel pretty comfortable that the logic of this book holds in mid-sized cities. I've just been to enough of them and seen the dynamics. What it doesn't necessarily fit with is rural areas, and so I think that's a separate line of research. I'm not the person to do that, but I do think that's unique, and so I think we have to be careful about that. And so yes, I would like to include some mid-sized cities in the next analysis. There's also a unique cluster of cities that are hospitality driven. Bend. So I've been to Bend, Asheville, North Carolina. I've been to Sun Valley, Santa Fe, New Mexico. They're basically all the same place. Bunch of rich people live there. People are retiring there. No one can afford to serve coffee. People 30-minute commutes for baristas. Like it's literally the same thing happening. And so that's also a unique cluster of cities that is, I think, is going to get some focus in the next book. So so one is we're going to hopefully write a book that's like homelessness is still a housing problem, basically. But we're going to include a few new things. One is the migrant crisis, which has really distorted homelessness rates in the last couple of years. So last year, homelessness went up about 12%. And part of that was because of, in essence, Southern governors busing people to cities and them showing up on shelter doorstep. And I was in DC before that came out, and there was a strong desire for political reasons not to focus on that. And so when the New York Times called, I didn't talk about that because we couldn't quantify it. We knew it was an issue. And so this year hasn't come out yet, but it should come out in December. And I think the numbers are going to go up a lot. I've heard that Chicago's number alone will triple because Denver, Chicago, and New York were the three primary destinations for migrants who are being bused from Texas. And we've been dealing with migrants for a long time, but they've organically made it into the United States and have not been overwhelmed shelter systems. We haven't had busing before. So I've been to all three of those cities, and it's been a massive issue. And so I think that has abated a bit because, the Biden administration really shut down the border over, for a variety of reasons, but we haven't had as many people coming in. But because we did the count in January, so I'm dying to see what these numbers are when they come out, because it's going to be a really challenging political message. And I don't know if HUD's going to say it's because of migration or not. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how they deal with that. So I think that's a really important thing that we want to address in the book. The other thing, which is a separate project, I want to write a different book, which is called Housing as Infrastructure, which is to reframe the way we think about housing. We invested $52 billion in an expansion of transit in Seattle. It was a fight, but ultimately we came up with the money, and it didn't change anyone's life. You pay more when you go to Seahawks game or something. All these different taxes came up $52 billion. When Governor Inslee proposed $4 billion for housing, he was like run out of the room. Like, that's ridiculous. So, why is $52 billion for transit fine and $4 billion for housing is ludicrous? It's because we don't think about housing as infrastructure. I think we fundamentally have to rethink that. It's more like a road and a bridge than it is a private good, but we just think of it as a private good. So there's a bunch of different things. And then I just want to do much more solution type stuff in that second one, hopefully underscoring the problem nature, and then go from there. But there's some work to do.
There may be some questions and some cards that are passing around the room. Because I also have him here, and then I'm going to ask you, gentlemen in the blue sweatshirt, to ask the next question. Dan Bryant. I'm also going to say, to flag for those of you who are not aware, Dan is retiring as the executive director of Square One Villages, coming up here in just a couple of weeks, and has been a really extraordinary and innovative leader in our community to address the crisis of homelessness and to help people have permanent, affordable housing in community. So Dan, I'm wondering if you could ask a third question.
Sure. Thank you, Karen. I can't say thank you enough. Before I began this work in housing, I was actually pastor of a downtown church for 29 years. I dealt with this on a daily basis. And that's why I went into housing work. I said, I got to figure out how to go upriver, stop the problem from happening, right? And we actually began doing shelter work, and we've morphed into creating a new housing model, cooperative housing co-ops. But what I'm really interested in is the systemic issue, and I really appreciate the way you have said it. But it strikes me, when I first heard you speak in Washington, D.C., almost 2 years ago, Matthew Desmond was also there talking about his new book, Poverty by America. And what blew me away in that book was his revelation that we spend more money in tax credits on the top 20% than we spend on social benefits to the bottom 20%. That's the systemic issue that I think is so critical that most people don't realize. Mortgage deductions and all the benefits that we get from the wealthy. That if we're going to address the systemic issue, we have to address that. And so I'll just ask how you would respond to that. And I also hope in your second book, you're dealing with the social housing model in Vienna as one of the solutions. So take it away.
Yeah, thank you. So Yeah, so Matt's amazing. He actually assigned our book in class, so I zoomed in and spoke in his class, which is a real thrill because he's obviously a big time person in this field. Yeah, I mean, one of the tricks we do with this is I'll sometimes ask folks, raise your hand if you live in subsidized housing, and no one raises their hand. And in fact, many of you should be raising your hands because you're getting a deduction on your taxes from the mortgage interest on your home, and so that's a really important fact that people don't realize. And so ironically, the Trump tax cuts in 2017, because they lowered tax rates, ended up reducing the value of that. So before the Trump tax cuts, it was about 60 billion a year. Now it's about 30 billion a year. 60 billion is more than HUD allocates to low-income housing policy. You could literally double what we're providing to low-income households by getting rid of that tax credit. Okay, well, we've chosen not to. Why? Right, that's a topic for another book. So anyway, you're absolutely right. I mean, we have structured a housing system that benefits white single-family homeowners. The mortgage finance system, the way that we insured that, the way that we blackline neighborhoods such that Black neighborhoods didn't get access to mortgage or mortgage insurance, right? This is all things that we designed, and we're living with the consequence of that. So you're absolutely right. The second question was social housing. Yeah. So we have a social housing bill referendum that's coming up in Seattle in February. And so there's a lot of excitement around that. And what I tell people is I think we should have more housing that is decommodified. Okay. So when we think about, decommodification is a scary term for some people because it comes from Marx. And it's like, oh my gosh. So Karl Marx is an economist. People don't realize that. And basically what he was just saying is being reliant on all your basic goods in the market isn't good. That was basically his argument. And so sociologists now have basically kind of used that term to think about how dependent are we on the market for our existence. Okay. So the United States is more commodified than Norway is and Sweden. Just they have decommodified more as they're still capitalists, but they just decommodified life a little bit. And so social housing is a way to decommodify housing. Right? There are other ways to do it. The local housing authority can buy more houses. That takes them out of the private market. That decommodifies housing. Doesn't create new units. It just recharacterizes them. And then we can build housing. So we used to build public housing. We used to have a lot of units. We're now around 1 million units of public housing. Nixon put a moratorium on public housing in 1973. And we basically shifted from building housing to providing vouchers. We marketized our housing system for low-income folks. So people have to go into the private market. They're commodified when they go in to use their vouchers. And so people are correctly saying, this doesn't make a lot of sense. And so this is when people start to call me a socialist. And so when people will say, like, we should have more publicly owned housing, whether it's social housing or whatever you want to call it, I'll say, one, this isn't socialism. So I already told you 1% of the housing is publicly owned in the United States, less than 1%. In Northern Europe, does anyone have an idea what it is in Northern Europe? What percent is publicly owned? It's 15 to 30%, depending on the country. So we could quadruple our level of social housing in the United States, and we're not even in the ballpark of other capitalist democracies in Northern Europe, right? We're just radically different from them. So, but it seems like a huge political leap to do that. And so we have to kind of step back and just say, even beyond Vienna, which is a city that's done things. But if you just look more broadly at the Netherlands and Germany, and it used to be the UK, but then Thatcher privatized a lot of that housing. It's not a massive leap to get there, but it feels like it. So absolutely, it's essential. And so I'm agnostic. However we get there, I'm all for it. Call it what you want it. I don't really care. We just need a lot more of it.
So another question here in the back. I've moved with the microphone to the back room. I could come to any of you at any moment, so please be preparing a question. This gentleman would like to follow up with another question related to not necessarily social housing, but the connotations around public housing.
Yeah. So, when we were all growing up, public housing, the wire, and, and the drugs and throwing all these people that are, and all that into these, that was housing, but it was the quality of the housing and the concerns around that. And so the question I have, I guess, is around what's to prevent us in having a knee-jerk reaction around our unhoused population and building these basically units that are not livable. And in that context.
Yep. So I have a bad habit of assigning reading. So my dissertation advisor at the University of Minnesota's Ed Getz wrote a book called New Deal Ruins, which is basically about the history of public housing. It's a fascinating read. Ed argues, contrary to public opinion, that public housing worked fairly well in the United States. We have a few really high-profile disasters, Cabrini Green in Chicago, Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis, which were admittedly big problems. But Ed was doing his dissertation at Northwestern, and when they started to talk about tearing down Cabrini Green, what happened? The people who lived there were protesting. People called it the gates of hell, literally. It was drugs, crime. I mean, it was so I got interested in this. I coached Little League Baseball in Cabrini Green when I moved to Chicago in 1997. So the firm that I work for sponsored a team. And so for 2 summers, I was coaching kids who were in the process of being moved out of Cabrini Green because they were tearing down the towers. Eye-opening experience for a kid from suburban Minneapolis, I can tell you that. Okay, radical different experiences. So Ed's point in the book was, if this is the gates of hell, why are these people not celebrating? You get out of hell. And they're saying, no, this is my home. What happened? We tore down the towers, we didn't build enough, and they got dispersed around the city and all sorts of bad things. So the point is like, was that a flawed program? Yes. Why? Because the federal government said you can only pay X dollars per square foot, which basically built prisons. My favorite story on this is in the 80s, no, it was the 70s. An official from the Soviet Union came over and was touring public housing in the United States, was in Chicago, and was interviewed, and he said, this is worse than our Soviet prisons. And so what happened was we put middle income, working folks post-World War II into public housing. Over time, we put lower income people in there for good reason, and white. That's right. And it was white working class. It becomes disproportionately Black and lower income. And the income that they can then pay is less, which means there's less money for upkeep. And what happens? The quality of these units go way down. And we cited them typically in Black neighborhoods, which then accentuated problems in these neighborhoods. And we end up with this vicious spiral downwards. And why did that happen? Because aldermen in Chicago who are white said, not in my neighborhood. So that's what we did. So anyway, so Ed would argue in this book that because of these high profile disasters and the way we did this, we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, when in fact, there's a bunch of social housing in St. Paul, Minnesota, and Seattle and New York that's working just fine right now. Does it need more money for upkeep? Absolutely. But we have completely taken that argument completely off the page. Like, our presidential candidates talked about housing more than any time in my lifetime over the last few months, but no one ever mentioned public housing. Why? I mean, you get run off the stage, right? And so I do think there's a conversation to be had. I would argue if I were a strategist, I wouldn't use the term public housing. I just don't think it's going to go anywhere. Even social housing, I would just say it's housing that's not in the market. Okay, I'm for that, right? I mean, we just have to think about the political framing of this, but I think we absolutely need to revisit that conversation, because I don't think we can regulate the market sufficiently to get to where we need to go. It doesn't mean there is an appropriate role for regulation, but I'm very skeptical of being able to do that at scale.
These last 3 are going to be rapid fire. Thank you for the people who took the time to write very thoughtful questions. I will summarize a couple of them into fewer words and make this one really pointed. So, what is the role of transportation in providing housing?
Huge role for transportation. In our region, as we invest $50 billion in transit, that's going to go up to Everett and down to Tacoma, and then east and west as much as we can with the mountains. I've been working with a group that's trying to make sure that we basically buy the land around those station areas, 50 station areas. If you have control of those station areas, you could build 10,000 units in the Watershed. 10,000 units times 50 station areas is 500,000 housing units. Our region has a deficit of about 800,000 housing units over the next 20 years. Like, now we're talking. The problem is, without strategic planning, we'll probably build 1,000 units around each of those station areas. 1,000 times 50 is 50,000. We still have 750,000 to go. That is a mistake that I think our great-grandchildren will say, like, what were you doing? This is a one-time, 1 in a 100-year, 200-year opportunity in Puget Sound region, and we're going to waste it. And so any transit investments have to have housing planning around it, because otherwise, who's going to jump in? Developers are going to jump in, buy that land, and make a ton of money. Because now you can live in Everett and work for Amazon, go down 3-4 days a week, whatever. It's going to be great for the region. It's just I'm deeply fearful that we are not going to optimize this incredible opportunity to create the housing capacity that we need. So it's front and center.
And as a tell for us locally, there's a term that comes up that oftentimes does sound scary to people because we've given it scary connotations, which is density, increasing density, higher density, more density is coming. Be careful about density, right? That's really not the issue we have in this community's context. We have incredibly low density, and in our center of our city, we have a lower residential density than we have in any of our neighborhoods, which is a huge problem and creates a lot of instability. I only wanted to offer that because if you find yourself in a conversation that is steering towards um, opposition to an idea about what density might mean, to instead be searching for a conversation about the quality of life or the community or the type of place that that might be or the ways in which it's changing could be helpful to us. I think that that gets to part of this next question, which will be the last one of the evening. Um, Policymakers often approach the issue of houselessness, pardon me, through the perspective of appeasing the anger of homeowners since they vote and make political donations rather than helping homeless people who don't vote or tend to vote and definitely don't make political donations. This leads to criminalization thinking rather than helping people. How can we overcome that? You have 30 seconds.
Well, I don't think that this challenge is unique to the field of homelessness. I think you could think about every public policy issue in the United States and basically ask the exact same question. And so I would be uh, ridiculously dumb to suggest that I have an answer to that. Uh, right? We have oil companies funding candidates who don't want to restrain carbon emissions. Okay, that seems to be a problem. And so, yeah, this is a longstanding issue, and so I wish I had an answer to that. I think one of the things that I say is to try to bring people to the table on this is you might be motivated to deal with homelessness for a variety of different issues. For some of you, it might just be a moral outrage. Fine, come to the table. For some of you, might say, I don't like going downtown Seattle anymore. Okay, come to the table. I understand. I own a restaurant. I'm sick and tired of people urinating outside my restaurant. I get it. Come to the table. Okay. Some of you might say it's incredibly expensive to just have homelessness, which it is. They're using the ER, criminal justice, the libraries, super expensive, right? We could build some housing and basically have a neutral cost and get people housed. I'm interested from an economic or fiscal perspective. Great, come to the table. And so, to me, I think there are enough arguments that hit people where they are, and I am a total pragmatist. Come on in, come into the table. And so I think there's a sufficient problem here and enough arguments to bring people from different persuasions. And so I think this ideological purity that if you aren't outraged morally, you're out. I think that's a counterproductive approach. I am outraged. But if you're driven to this from an economic perspective, come on, let's work together on this. I fundamentally believe that that's important.
And it's a huge benefit to us as a community and a strength if we have many reasons for working on something and taking action together. So another way to think about that diversity of opinions as actually being a real strength. Thank you all so much for being with us here this evening. Thank you, Greg, for being a great example of a person who is doing research and teaching at the University of Washington, but also sharing that research in such an accessible way all across the country. It's very powerful. I also want to say thank you to all of the different partners and examples that were shared as other good examples in the pinups that were out in the lobby before this program. There is a lot of great work happening in this community by very committed people who care about helping us to become a more beautiful and connected community. So thank you for that work. We will see you next time and enjoy your evenings.